as kind of, let's say, joy and gratitude, affection, and things of that sort. But what might happen is that they might produce too much. They might have more children than they really need or want, either to support themselves in their old age, as you would traditionally, or in the sense that, geez, you're kind of an ungrateful child, maybe we should have thought twice about having you. Now, of course, your parents aren't going to say that to you, but there is the idea that given your initial decision of to have or not have children, there might be an imbalance because you make the decision at one point in time and you get the benefit at another point in time. Now, obviously, the world hasn't ended. We haven't ended in a population bomb. It's been over 2 centuries since Malthus wrote his essays. So, what happened? Well, most demographers think of this in terms of the demographic transition, which means, as contrary to what Malthus believed about what would happen to food supply, population, etc., actually most developing countries, as they develop, go under what's called a demographic transition. And you can kind of see a chart of what the demographic transition is here. So this is kind of the pattern that happens in most societies. And let's take this stage by stage with this chart. So in the pre-transition stage, which would typify most, let's say, pre-modern societies, most, let's say, hunter-gatherer or early agricultural societies, is that you have high birth rates, seen here by the green line, but you also have high death rates. So what does that exactly mean? So in a primitive society, a hunter-gatherer society probably is the best example of this, you have very high death rates. People don't live to be 30 years old. 30, 35 is old age for most people, which means that people are dying. They can die from infection, disease, predators, exposure to the elements, things of that sort. You have a lot of people dying. And if you don't want the species to die off, you have to have a relatively high birth rate. You need more people or more children coming in to take up, fill in for the ranks of the dying. Otherwise, the species is going to die off or the numbers are going to decline. And so this is probably why you see in early religion, particularly hunter-gatherer societies, a lot of fertility cults. Because having enough children was key to making sure the society sustained itself and continued. And so if you see the very first, let's say, religious idols, you see these Venus figurines that look like pregnant women, right? Women with large bellies, large breasts, and kind of, let's say, even if you look into the early Judeo-Christian religious books, you often see them fighting against these pagan idols like Baal, who were fertility gods, gods and goddesses. And so what you had is you see kind of a shift from gods representing the sun and agriculture, displacing gods that had a focus on human fertility, particularly female fertility. And this showed a little bit of the changing of the values. Well, what happens over time as societies develop? Well, once you get to a relatively, advanced agricultural or early industrial society, the death rate is going to go down. People are going to get better food. People are going to get better medicine. There's a lot of reasons why people will live longer lives. And so you go from living about 30 years on average to living something closer to maybe like 60 or 70 years becomes the basic expectation. Now, the problem is we don't actually know how long when you're born, you don't know how long you're going to live. Right? So your parents don't know how long that they're going to live longer, right? Their parents only lived to be 30 years old, so their expectation is, well, we'll probably only live to be 30 years old. They don't realize that modern advances means they might actually live longer. They might live to 40 or 50 or 60 years. Okay? Because they're basing their decisions upon what's happened in the past. And in the past, okay, everyone had a lot of children, and lots of people died at young ages. But the change happens, and oh, wait, we're starting to live 50 or 60 years. And so that death rate goes down. But they're still having a lot of children because they don't know that yet. And so they're still having 15, 16, 17 children. People are getting married at 14 or 15 years old. They're having four children by the time they're 20. Look at an old gravestone from the colonial times, and what you'll see is that you'll have one man, 4 or 5 wives, most of which died in childbirth, and their 18 to 20 children that they bore, most of which died before the age of 5. That was a very typical pattern before the Industrial Revolution. So what happens is the death rate has come down, but the birth rate has remained relatively high. And you can see there's a gap opening up in the early transition period. And this gap, where death rates decline but birth rates stay high, is where population grows, right? More people being born, less people dying, the population is getting larger, and the demands on the food supply increase. Now, the demographic transition says eventually people figure it out. They realize they're not going to live to be 30, that they can have a relatively secure expectation that they'll live to be, say, 50, 60, 70 years old. And eventually decide, hey, I don't actually need all these kids. I don't have to start having kids at an early age. I can postpone marriage. I can do other things. And so eventually, and this is mostly about the attitudes of women, is the birth rate comes down too. And so if you look at most modern societies, okay, like the United States, most of Western Europe, Japan, you have a very low death rate. People live to be 70, 80 years old in most of these countries. And you also have a very low birth rate. Okay, if you look at, let's say, your parents' families, your grandparents' families, your great-grandparents' families, the trend that most people are noticing is that there's fewer and fewer people generation after generation. Most of you probably have one, maybe two siblings. Your parents probably had something about 4 or 5. Early generations, like my grandmother, she had 8 children. And if you go farther and farther back, you're going to see larger and larger families, except that maybe some of these children died in childbirth or before they grew to their adult ages. So eventually, instead of getting this runaway effect, you actually get stability, because once you reach a low death rate and a low birth rate, okay, you don't have, let's say, this kind of huge increase in population. The level of the population levels off. So this is just to recapitulate what I just said. Poor societies, high birth rates, high death rates. Eventually what happens, life expectancy is low, and infant mortality is high, and therefore birth rates must be high to overcome the fact that people aren't going to live very long, and most people don't survive past age 5 in these societies. But as death rates decline, health improves, the high birth rates lag, and the population explodes. But fortunately, contra to Malthus, as countries mature, birth rates decrease, because people eventually figure it out, although with maybe a 50 or 60 year time lag, and they realize that, and the population, the number of children people will have, they practice birth control, they get married later, they do a lot of things that will reduce the number of children you have, and the population level will stabilize. Now, that's not saying it's going to stabilize at a good level, but the point is that it's not going to keep going up and up and up. It's not going to, let's say, necessarily push the food supply limitation. It's going to find kind of a natural level where people realize they don't need to have as many children to keep the population going. So another way of thinking about this is that we don't really have an overpopulation problem everywhere in the world. We have some areas in the world that are suffering from overpopulation, including most of the developing world, and other parts of the world where we have underpopulation. So in the developing world, overpopulation, places like sub-Saharan Africa, some parts of Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, arguably maybe India and China still, where we have an overpopulation problem. But if you look actually at the statistics for, let's say, Western Europe, Japan, South Africa, Australia, Canada, the United States, the developed world, our population are shrinking. So, for example, right now the population of Japan is between 120 and 130 million. By 2050, which is only about 40 years in the future, if current trends continue, the population of Japan will shrink to be about only 80 million to 90 million. So it'll decrease by 25 to 30%. Because they're actually having fewer children than they need to replace the people who are actually alive. Now, to keep the population at a stable level, you have to have a fertility rate of about 2.1. So think of this way. A father, a mother, need 2 children to replace themselves in the population, right? One child replaces the father, one child replaces the mother. Now, because not all children reach adulthood, or not all children will get married and have children, you actually need a slightly higher rate. So it's really about 2.1 is stability. And here you can see some of the trends around the world as far as fertility rates, and also the difference between less developed and more developed countries. So going from left to right here, we can start looking at the world fertility rate, how many children are born per woman, from about 1965 until, let's say, around the early mid-90s. And what you can see is that the number of children is going down as people all around the world are living longer. So, for example, in 1965, 1970, a little under 5 children per woman of childbearing age was about normal. Now it's about 2.5 average for the entire world. Now that means that the population is still growing, because as long as the overall rate is above 2.1%, which it still is, the population is going to grow. There are more children being born than are needed to replace the people that are living today. Now, if you go rightward, we can see that there's a quite clear difference between less developed and developing countries. Less developing countries at every single point in time have higher birth rates than the average, and they're all growing. So maybe not as fast as they were before, but they're all growing. A good example of this is comparing maybe the Israeli population with the Palestinians. And this is driving a lot of the concerns, because the Israeli population looks like the United States. It's relatively mature, stable, low birth rates for part of the Jewish population, not so much for the conservative Hasidic populations. They tend to have high birth rates. But generally, it looks like a mature, developed country, low death rates, low birth rates. If you look at the Palestinian population, you have relatively high death rates. People are not living as long as their neighbors, but they are having a lot more children, and so their population is growing relatively quickly. Now, if we look at the developed countries like the United States, Japan, Western Europe, you can see we've been below replacement rate really since the 1970s. The average woman is having less than 2 children. Now, the United States is actually a little bit on the high end. I think we're at a little over 2.1, mostly driven by immigrant populations in the United States that resemble the developing world more than the developed world. But if we look at the European stock American population, most, let's say, European descendant women are actually not replacing themselves in the population pool. So they're having, let's say, on average, less than 2 children per adult woman, childbearing age. And that means that the population, or more specifically, you might call the white population, the European population, is decreasing. And it's also decreasing in places like Japan too. And this is a cause for concern. It's one reason why many European countries do a lot of things to encourage women to have more children, whether paying for the delivery, prenatal, neonatal care, providing a free nanny and other things, to try to encourage women to have more children, because they're worried that their populations are going to shrink over time. Now, what's driving a lot of this, what's driving the fact that women are having less children, is that women are choosing to do a different thing. Women can face 2 choices. They could work, or focus on work, on a career, or they could have children. Now, I know most women think that they're a superwoman and they can do both, or try to do both, raise children and have a full